welcome to episode 31 of the Abbasid History Podcast, an audio platform to examine pre-modern Islamicate history and a global medieval past. We are sponsored by IHRC Bookshop. Listeners get a 15% discount on all purchases. Visit IHRC Bookshop at shop.ihrc.org and use discount code AHP15 at checkout. Terms and conditions apply. Contact IHRC Bookshop for details. We are also sponsored by Turath Publishing. Listeners get a 15% discount on all purchases. Visit Turath Publishing at turath.co.uk and use discount code POD15 at checkout. Terms and conditions apply. Contact Turath Publishing for details. I am your host, Talha Asan, a PhD student at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. Now onto the show. The laws of dhimma, or governance of non-Muslim minorities in a Muslim polity, can arouse difficult feelings amongst both Muslims and non-Muslims, especially at sites of tension and conflict between them around the globe. To discuss with us today a medieval legal work on these rulings is Dr. Antonia Bosanquet, author of Minding Their Place, Space and Religious Hierarchy in Ibn al-Qayyim's Aḥkām al-dhimma, published by Brill in 2021. She is currently a researcher at the University of Hamburg. Welcome, Dr. Bosanquet.
Hi, well, thank you for having me on the show.
Before we look at Ibn al-Qayyim on dhimma governance, first let's ask ourselves, what is dhimma governance? Our modern sensibilities as residents of secular nation states find discrimination based on religious background offensive, although arguably that's precisely what some European countries do today.
You're right. A lot of people do find the concept of dhimma governance problematic or offensive, and it is quite far removed from contemporary norms of religious tolerance that most Western states at least pay lip service to today. We are talking about a system that began to be developed around the 8th or the 9th century, though. So personally, I don't think we need to evaluate it in relation to contemporary ideas about religious difference. But in answer to your question, the Arabic term dhimma means protection, and the dhimma are the people or the ahl who are protected under Islamic rule. Sometimes they're called the dhimma, and sometimes they're called dhimmis. And this is a legal category. It referred to non-Muslims who lived permanently under Islamic rule, so not travelers or traders passing through places of Islamic rule. These people had a different legal status. The dhimma were the communities of non-Muslims who were a permanent feature of most Muslim societies. And they were usually Christians and Jews. We do find discussions about whether people with other religions, like Zoroastrianism, can be dhimma, but most legal authors only really talk about Jews and Christians. And sometimes the jurists explain this by saying that Judaism and Christianity are monotheistic scriptural religions and therefore closer to Islam or more acceptable to God than other religions. And so Christians and Jews are allowed to live as Christians and Jews under Islamic rule, but members of other religions should convert or leave the realm of Islam. So Christians and Jews had a protected status under Islamic law. This meant firstly that if they were attacked or their possessions were stolen, then the perpetrator would be punished. You couldn't attack a Christian or a Jew with impunity. They also had a degree of religious and legal autonomy. They could practice their religion relatively freely, and they could administer their communities according to their law, rather than Islamic law in most cases. So, for example, if a Christian man got married, he didn't have to comply with the conditions that a Muslim man would have to follow in order for the marriage to be recognized. As part of this protection agreement, the dhimma also had to pay a special tax called the jizya, which varied depending on how much money they had. And there were other rules that they had to follow, that related to things like clothing and the manifestation of their religion in public spaces. And these rulings are often what readers today find offensive because they do envisage a different social status for non-Muslims, and they do limit the way that Jews and Christians can display their religion in public. I find it really interesting the way that the dhimmi laws link the status of religion to the construction of public space, and that's a key focus in my book. And of course, it is relevant to discussions about how societies deal with religious difference today as well. However, I do think it's important to add here that the rules for dhimmis that we read in legal textbooks are the theoretical discussions in which the legal scholars spoke to one another. They don't necessarily tell us what was actually happening in the 14th century or whenever the textbooks were written. For example, we can read what the jurists said about how much jizya tax should be collected from the Jewish and the Christian communities, but we have other evidence, like papyrus documents or other literary texts, that suggest that sometimes a community didn't pay any tax, and sometimes it paid more than a specific jurist specified. So in my book, I looked at what one jurist, Ibn al-Qayyim, wrote about non-Muslims, but I analysed his writing from the standpoint of intellectual history. I didn't use it to draw conclusions about the historical or social situation of non-Muslims in 14th century Damascus. Maybe we can come back to this point if we have time.
Before we look at Ibn al-Qayyim's work, tell us about the life and career of the author. He was born in Damascus, 1292 Common Era.
Yes, he was born in Damascus and he lived here for most of his life, and he died here too in 1350 Common Era. Other than the Hajj and some time in Egypt, he didn't undertake long journeys for the sake of knowledge, the talab al-ilm, that earlier scholars had done. But perhaps he didn't feel as if he needed to, because by the late 13th century, when Ibn al-Qayyim was born, Damascus had become one of the most important cultural centers of the Islamic world. This was partly because of the increasing Mongol control over the east, which led some of the population to head west to Syria and Egypt, where Mamluk rule had made the region more stable. It's also because the Mamluk rulers over Syria and Egypt were quite accommodating towards religious scholars and open to most sorts of scholarship. So there seems to have been a general uptake in learning around this time. It was a good place to come if you were a member of the cultural elite. And Ibn al-Qayyim was a Hanbali legal scholar. And this is relevant because in the time that he was living there, Damascus was probably the center for Hanbali scholars or scholarship in the Islamic world. Up until the 13th century, Baghdad was really the only city where the Hanbalis had a significant presence. But after the Mongols besieged and then sacked it in 1258, most of the Hanbalis came to Damascus and joined the very small community that was already there. So, although the Hanbali school was small in the 14th century, it had quite a strong presence when Ibn al-Qayyim was living there, and it was probably a very vibrant, dynamic community to work in. So he grew up close to this Hanbali community in Damascus, and as we can see from his name, Ibn al-Qayyim, his dad was the custodian or the Qayyim of the Jawziyya Madrasa, which was also a court for the Hanbali chief judge. So he was clearly involved with the Hanbali community from quite an early age. And he studied with some quite prominent Hanbali teachers. His most famous teacher was Ibn Taymiyyah, who probably doesn't need an introduction here. And Ibn Taymiyyah was also the most important influence on Ibn al-Qayyim. Ibn al-Qayyim's teaching is so influenced by Ibn Taymiyyah's thought that it's almost impossible to imagine him writing or to think what he would have said without this Taymiyyan influence. And actually, Ibn al-Qayyim didn't start writing until Ibn Taymiyyah's death in 1328. Both Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim were sent to prison in 1326 for condemning the visitation of graves, and Ibn Taymiyyah died while he was in prison. Ibn al-Qayyim was then released, and only then did he start writing the works that we have today. So he was in his 50s when he started writing, but he made up for lost time by writing a huge amount on a really wide range of subjects. He wrote about Quranic exegesis, theology, interreligious polemic, spiritual self-betterment, and he also wrote some books that are more difficult to define as a specific genre because they have a bit of everything in them. So the book that I looked at, Aḥkām al-dhimma, is a bit like that actually. The title, Aḥkām al-dhimma, indicates that it's a book of rulings, Aḥkām, about the al-dhimma, but it doesn't just have rulings in it. It's also got quite a few sections that have a more theological orientation, like a discussion about what happens to Jewish and Christian children if they die before they convert to Islam. That's one of the most interesting discussions in the book. And Ibn al-Qayyim relates this question to Mu'tazilite concerns about divine judgment in the afterlife and human responsibility for their acts. It's not a typical question for a legal compendium, and Ibn al-Qayyim doesn't discuss it in the way that legal texts tend to discuss questions, but it's a central part of Aḥkām al-dhimma, so it changes the nature of the book. And Ibn al-Qayyim also includes a long discussion about how to punish a dhimmi who curses the Prophet, which is actually taken from Ibn Taymiyyah, and which isn't treated in any other legal compendia in the same length, as far as I know. And there's also a long passage about employing Jews and Christians in public service, which is completely unlike any discussion that you would find in other legal works written before or after Aḥkām al-dhimma. So often, Ibn al-Qayyim picks up questions that other jurists look at too, but he treats them differently, and he draws different conclusions from them than the other legal authors have done. So he's a bit of an unusual writer, and Aḥkām al-dhimma is a bit of an unusual book for its time.
You argue that Ibn al-Qayyim's book should be seen as more of a personal interpretation of what ought to be done, rather than reflective of actual practice on the ground.
Yes, I do. I don't see Aḥkām al-dhimma as reflecting accurately how Jews and Christians were actually governed or treated in Islamic societies. I also don't see it as necessarily reflecting the standard legal discussion about Muslim-non-Muslim relations in the 14th century. On the first point, I don't think we can see this book as reflecting 100% how Jews and Christians were governed in practice, because we can't really tell from reading the book how the rules that Ibn al-Qayyim presents were implemented. We don't even know whether they were implemented. For example, I said before that there's a section in Aḥkām al-dhimma discussing the prohibition of employing Jews and Christians in public office as tax officials, for example. And this is something that Ibn al-Qayyim feels very strongly about, and he brings together statements from different texts and different teachers to emphasize his argument that only Muslims can be employed in this capacity. But the fact that he feels the need to uphold this ruling so strongly suggests that it probably wasn't being kept in practice. And we know from other literary sources, and also from documentary sources, that there were lots of Christians working in the state administration, especially in Egypt. Another example is Christian festivities. Ibn al-Qayyim lists rulings prohibiting the celebration of Christian religious festivals, and he's very emphatic that Christians can only celebrate their holy days inside the church. But again, even from the way that he discusses the question, it's obvious that these rules are not being kept. And we know from other sources that some of the festivals that the Coptic Christians celebrated involved huge processions through the streets of Cairo, and that Muslims participated as well. So we would be naive to think that just because Ibn al-Qayyim said that these rules are obligatory, that this is how Jews and Christians were actually governed. But I also think, and this is my second point, I think we are naive if we see the rulings in Aḥkām al-dhimma as a reflection of the standard legal discourse in the 14th century. And I say this partly because a lot of the material in Aḥkām al-dhimma isn't typical for legal compendia. For example, Ibn al-Qayyim's long discussion about prohibiting Christian employment in Muslim administration, and his very detailed summary of punishing a non-Muslim who insults the Prophet. We don't find these in earlier legal texts, or even texts that were written around the same time and that Ibn al-Qayyim could have drawn on. So Ibn al-Qayyim was not reading everything that his jurist colleagues were writing about dhimmis and then summarizing it all in a single dhimmi-focused book, which he called Aḥkām al-dhimma. What he was doing was picking and choosing teachings that were interesting for him. Or he might have been reproducing the material from a lesson that Ibn Taymiyyah taught about dhimmis in one of his study circles. Either way, the material in Aḥkām al-dhimma comes from different sources, not all of them legal, which Ibn al-Qayyim then edited very heavily, and he comments and explains them in a way that builds up his own argument about what he thinks should be the role of dhimmis in an Islamic society. So I see this as a personal argument, probably heavily influenced by Ibn Taymiyyah, that Ibn al-Qayyim makes through legal and quasi-legal discussion. I also think if Ibn al-Qayyim's book had have comprised the standard legal teaching, then it would have been more widely received after it was written. But I tracked the reception of Aḥkām al-dhimma in a recent article, and it doesn't seem to have been very popular or authoritative at all. Of course, there are lots of reasons for why a book isn't widely read, but part of the reason for this might be because Ibn al-Qayyim's arguments were just not that relevant to discussions on the topic during the 14th and the 15th century. So I find Aḥkām al-dhimma fascinating as an insight into Ibn al-Qayyim's ideas about non-Muslims and religious difference. But I don't think there's much evidence for seeing his view or the teachings that he includes as a reflection of how all jurists interpreted this question in the 14th century. And I think it's even less likely that all of the rulings that he discusses were actually implemented.
Turning to the present, the most recent attempt after almost a century and a half to apply dhimma rulings was by ISIS in their failed state. Ibn al-Qayyim today is best regarded for his works on personal spiritual reform. The call for Sharia in the modern Muslim world is often seen synonymous as a call for justice against corruption, but can make non-Muslim minorities feel uncomfortable. Can medieval dhimma rulings still find a place to critique today's world of imagined communities and the fictions of nationalism?
It's interesting that you mention ISIS and their use of the dhimma rulings. When ISIS took control of Raqqa, most of the Christian community had already left. The small number who remained played a more representative role in the politics of ISIS than they were a logistical obstacle for control of the city. Through their governance of this community, ISIS was sending out a message about how they planned to construct their caliphate. And considering that Western institutions often use treatments of minorities and treatment of women as the litmus test for measuring other societies or cultures, it's not surprising that ISIS also very ostentatiously embraced this set of rulings when constructing their alternative society that challenges Western political and cultural hegemony. Another interesting example of how the discussion of dhimmi rulings is used to define a society in relation to the West is a comparison between the way that two Muslim scholars, Subh Salih and Safar al-Hawali, interpret the rules in Aḥkām al-dhimma about the employment of non-Muslims. And I compare these two examples because both men they've both died, I think. They were very politically and religiously engaged, and they both saw medieval dhimmi rulings as definitive for the contemporary discussion, but they reached different conclusions. So Subh Saleh was a Lebanese Sunni Muslim who was also the first editor of the printed version of Aḥkām al-dhimma. It was published in 1961. And in his introduction to the book, he gave an overview of dhimmi law. And in this overview, he criticizes Ibn al-Qayyim for being too harsh on the question of employing non-Muslims. According to Subh Saleh, non-Muslims are not forbidden to work in the administration of a Muslim state. They are eligible for all the same positions as Muslims are, except positions of religious leadership. Now, Subh Saleh was a Lebanese Sunni Muslim who had studied in France and then returned and lived in Lebanon in the 1950s and the 1960s. And he was responding to sectarian strife in Lebanon and to criticism from the Western world that Islam was undemocratic or intolerant. So his concern was to establish a multi-confessional society within a Sunni Islamic framework. And that's why he saw a need to correct Ibn al-Qayyim on the topic of employment. In Subh Saleh's understanding of a pluralist society, which was probably influenced by the time that he spent in France, employment opportunities can't be limited by people's religions. And so he depicts Ibn al-Qayyim's prohibition as an anomaly, and he argues that most other Islamic jurists, or the Islamic tradition in general, does actually allow non-Muslims to hold positions of authority in the Muslim state. The other example, Safar al-Hawali, was a Saudi preacher who was very influential in the 1990s, especially during the First Gulf War. In 1990, he gave a sermon quoting Aḥkām al-dhimma and criticizing the employment of non-Muslims as prohibited and contrary to dhimmi regulations. Rather than seeing Ibn al-Qayyim as having been too strict, as Subh Saleh did, Safar al-Hawali uses Ibn al-Qayyim's teaching to support his criticism of the Saudi policy of cooperating with US economic concerns and especially with the military operations that were part of the Gulf War. So, unlike ISIS, neither Subh Saleh in Lebanon nor Safar al-Hawali in Saudi Arabia are calling for a reinstatement of all the dhimmi rulings. They don't see the Dhimmi Pact as a whole as something that needs to be imposed on the non-Muslims in their country. But they do see these rulings as relevant for their contemporary situation. When they discuss whether the state's employment of non-Muslims is legitimate, they both refer back to Aḥkām al-dhimma and other pre-modern rulings about this question. And the fact that they interpret the question so differently is because of the specific socio-political situation that they're responding to and the difference in their own personal views about religious plurality within national boundaries. It doesn't affect the fact that for both men, these dhimma rulings are still key to regulating the social participation of non-Muslims in an Islamic society.
And finally, before we end, tell us where listeners can turn next to learn more about today's topic and what are other current projects that listeners can anticipate.
Well, if you want to read more about Ibn al-Qayyim and Aḥkām al-dhimma, then you can read my book, which is called Minding Their Place, Space and Religious Hierarchy in Ibn al-Qayyim's Aḥkām al-dhimma. I've written some articles on the things that I talked about in this podcast as well. You can find them on my academia page. I'm happy to send PDFs if you can't get them through other channels. There's been a lot of excellent research on Ibn al-Qayyim recently. So if you're interested in Ibn al-Qayyim's wider thought, you can look at works by Livnat Holtzman, Birgit Kravitz, Marie Ovadia, and John Hoover, amongst others. And if you're interested in dhimmi regulation and non-Muslim relations with Muslims in Islamic law, then a good text to start with is Johannes Friedman's Tolerance and Coercion in Islam, or Anwar Eman's book on religious pluralism and Islamic law. There are many other excellent books and writers on this topic, but I think it would take too long to list all my favourites here. So these are just two introductions to what is a very, very wide field. You also asked about current projects, didn't you? And so my work on Aḥkām al-dhimma was my PhD project. And I think in some ways your PhD is a bit like your first love affair. When it finishes, you can't imagine committing to another project with the same intensity or range of emotions that you do with your PhD, which is probably a good thing actually. But I took quite a while to settle into a different project, and I've got a very different focus in my work now. I'm looking at the Islamication of North Africa during the 9th century. So I'm keeping the legal focus going because I use legal works as my main source texts. But the research question in my new project is how this region was integrated into the cultural and economic sphere of the Abbasid Empire under the rule of the Aghlabids over Africa. It's a different thematic focus, it's a different period, and it's a different geographical space to Ibn al-Qayyim's Damascus. And instead of Muslim relations with non-Muslims, I'm thinking about Ibadis and Sunnis, Arabs and non-Arabs, and the relevance of trade in slaves and gold to the transformation of the region. So it's something very different, and I'm actually really enjoying it. So I hope to have more stuff out on that soon.
Dr. Bosanquet, thank you for being a guest on the Abbasid History Podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been lovely talking to you.